Sometimes the most powerful people are the ones you'd never suspect. They walk among us quietly, carrying invisible burdens and hidden strengths that only reveal themselves when the moment demands it. They endure whispers, cruel laughter, and dismissive glances, all while holding secrets that could silence every critic in an instant. But they choose silence over spectacle, dignity over drama. This is the story of Sarah Martinez, a woman whose gentle demeanor and unassuming presence made her an easy target for workplace bullies and social climbers. What they didn't know was that beneath her quiet exterior lay the heart of a warrior, forged in the crucible of elite military service and tempered by missions that would break lesser souls. In a world obsessed with appearances and quick judgments, Sarah's story reminds us that true strength doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it waits patiently in the shadows, ready to emerge when honor demands it. And when that moment finally comes, the revelation can be earth-shattering for those who never bothered to look beyond the surface. Get ready to witness a transformation that will challenge everything you think you know about strength, respect, and the price of underestimating someone who has already proven themselves in ways most people can't even imagine. Sarah Martinez stepped through the glass doors of Blackstone Securities on a crisp Monday morning in October, clutching a worn leather briefcase and wearing a simple navy blazer that had seen better days. At 34, she carried herself with an understated confidence that most people missed entirely. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her shoes, while polished, were clearly chosen for comfort over fashion. To the employees already settled into their morning routines, she looked like just another middle management hire trying to make a good first impression. The receptionist, a perfectly manicured woman named Jessica, who took pride in sizing up every newcomer within seconds, barely glanced up from her computer screen. "You must be the new risk assessment coordinator," she said with a tone that managed to sound both welcoming and dismissive at once. "Human Resources is expecting you on the 3rd floor. Elevators are to your right." As Sarah waited for the elevator, she caught fragments of whispered conversations from nearby cubicles. The open-plan office buzzed with the kind of casual gossip that feeds corporate culture. She heard snippets about weekend parties, expensive purchases, and vacation plans to exotic destinations. When the elevator doors opened with a soft chime, she stepped inside alone, grateful for a moment of quiet before the inevitable introductions and explanations that awaited her upstairs. The 3rd floor was a maze of glass-walled offices and collaborative workspaces designed to promote transparency and teamwork. Sarah found the Human Resources department easily enough, where Margaret Chen, the director, was waiting with a stack of paperwork and an apologetic smile. Margaret was in her late 40s, with the kind of professional warmth that made new employees feel immediately at ease. "Sarah, welcome to Blackstone Securities," Margaret said, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. "I know starting a new job can be overwhelming, but everyone here is really excited to have someone with your background join the team. Your experience in risk assessment is exactly what we need for the government contracts division." They spent the next hour reviewing company policies, benefit packages, and the organizational structure. Sarah filled out forms with methodical precision, her handwriting neat and economical. When Margaret mentioned the company's casual Friday policy and upcoming holiday party, Sarah nodded politely but didn't offer much commentary. She wasn't being unfriendly, just careful about revealing too much too soon. "Your direct supervisor will be David Harrison," Margaret continued, pulling up his profile on her computer. "He runs a tight ship in the government contracts division, and he's got some interesting projects coming up that I think you'll find challenging in the best possible way. Let me walk you over and introduce you." The government contracts division occupied the northeast corner of the building, with windows that offered a view of the city's financial district. David Harrison's office was at the center of it all, strategically positioned to keep an eye on his team of 12 specialists. He was a man in his early 50s who had built his reputation on delivering complex projects on time and under budget. His handshake was firm, his eye contact direct, and his first impression of Sarah was cautiously optimistic. "Margaret's told me good things about your background," David said, settling back into his chair. "Risk assessment for government contracts is specialized work, and frankly, we've been drowning without proper expertise in that area. Your resume shows some interesting experience, though I notice there are a few gaps in your employment history." Sarah had prepared for this question, as she always did. "I took some time away from traditional employment to pursue specialized training and consulting work," she replied smoothly. "The skills I developed during that period are directly applicable to the work you need done here." It wasn't technically a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The truth was something she had learned to package carefully, revealing only what was necessary and keeping the rest locked away where it couldn't complicate her civilian life. David seemed satisfied with her explanation and moved on to discussing the specific projects she would be handling. Her workspace was a corner cubicle with a view of the parking garage, which suited her just fine. She preferred having her back to a wall and clear sightlines to the office entrances, habits that had become second nature over the years. As she arranged her few personal belongings on the desk, her new colleagues began introducing themselves with varying degrees of enthusiasm. The first was Kevin Walsh, an ambitious 30-something analyst who had joined the company straight from business school and never missed an opportunity to mention his MBA from Northwestern. He was handsome in an obvious way, with perfectly styled hair and an expensive watch that he had a habit of checking dramatically during conversations. Kevin made his living by being the smartest person in the room, or at least making sure everyone thought he was. "So Sarah, welcome to the war zone," Kevin said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hope you're ready to hit the ground running because David doesn't believe in breaking people in gently." "What's your background? Previous company downsizing force you into the job market?" Before Sarah could answer, Linda Morrison appeared at her cubicle entrance. Linda was the unofficial social coordinator for the office, a woman who knew everyone's business and wasn't shy about sharing it. She had been with the company for 8 years and had developed a sixth sense for office politics that served her well in her role as senior project coordinator. "Don't listen to Kevin," Linda said with a laugh that carried more edge than warmth. "He just likes to scare the new people." "Though I have to say, Sarah, you're certainly jumping into an interesting time. The government contracts division has been under a lot of pressure lately, and David's been pretty stressed about finding someone who can actually handle the security clearance requirements for some of these projects." The mention of security clearances caused a brief flicker in Sarah's expression, so quick that anyone not watching closely would have missed it entirely. But Kevin was watching, and he filed away that reaction for future reference. He had built his career on reading people and finding their weak spots, and something about Sarah's carefully neutral responses suggested there was more to her story than she was letting on. "Speaking of security clearances," Kevin said casually, "that process can be pretty invasive. Background checks, interviews with former colleagues, the whole 9 yards. Some people find it pretty stressful if they've got anything interesting in their past they'd rather keep private." Sarah met his gaze directly, her voice steady and professional. "I don't anticipate any problems with the clearance process," she said simply. "My background is straightforward enough." The rest of her first day passed uneventfully, filled with orientation sessions, system passwords, and the usual administrative tasks that come with joining any large organization. Sarah observed her new environment carefully, noting the informal hierarchies and social dynamics that would shape her daily experience. She could already see the fault lines beginning to form around her presence, the subtle ways that some colleagues were trying to place her in their mental organizational chart. By the time she gathered her things to leave at 5:30, Sarah had formed preliminary assessments of everyone she had met. David seemed fair and focused on results, which would make him a good supervisor as long as she delivered quality work. Margaret in HR was genuinely helpful and would be a valuable ally if any problems arose. Linda Morrison was the kind of person who collected information like currency, someone to be careful around but not necessarily hostile. Kevin Walsh was the one who would require the most careful handling. His questions had been too pointed, his interest too intense for someone simply making conversation with a new colleague. He was the type who couldn't resist picking at loose threads to see what unraveled, and Sarah recognized that he had already marked her as someone worth investigating further. As she rode the elevator down to the lobby, Sarah reflected on the delicate balance she would need to maintain in this new environment. She had become expert at blending in, at being competent without being remarkable, professional without being memorable. But she could already sense that Blackstone Securities would test those skills in ways her previous jobs hadn't. The parking garage was mostly empty by the time she reached her car, a reliable sedan that was clean and well-maintained but unremarkable in every way. As she unlocked the door, she noticed Kevin Walsh's BMW parked a few spaces away, its pristine condition and premium features a stark contrast to her practical choice in transportation. She wondered if he had noticed the difference and what conclusions he might draw from it. Driving home through evening traffic, Sarah allowed herself to think about the challenges that lay ahead. She had learned from experience that the first few weeks at any new job were crucial for establishing her professional identity. Too friendly, and people became curious about her personal life. Too aloof, and they became suspicious about her motives. She needed to find that sweet spot where she could be competent and collegial without inviting the kind of scrutiny that might lead to uncomfortable questions. Her apartment was a modest one-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood, furnished with practical pieces that prioritized function over style. The walls were decorated with a few landscape photographs and some books that suggested broad intellectual interests without revealing anything too personal. It was the kind of space that could belong to any professional woman who valued privacy and simplicity over making impressions. That evening, as she prepared for her second day at Blackstone Securities, Sarah reviewed the employee handbook and organizational chart one more time. She made mental notes about company culture, dress codes, and social expectations. She had learned that success in any organization depended as much on understanding the unwritten rules as the official ones. Before going to bed, she checked her phone for messages and found a text from her sister Maria asking how the first day had gone. Sarah's response was brief and optimistic, sharing just enough information to satisfy family concern without revealing her growing unease about Kevin Walsh's interest in her background. She had become skilled at managing these conversations, maintaining connections while protecting the boundaries she needed to keep her two worlds separate. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah's last thoughts were about the choices she had made to get to this point in her life. Every decision had been calculated to create distance from her past while building a sustainable future. She had sacrificed recognition, advancement opportunities, and even relationships to maintain the careful anonymity that allowed her to live peacefully in the civilian world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove herself professionally while maintaining the protective barriers she had worked so hard to construct. She had handled similar situations before, and she was confident she could handle this one too. What she couldn't know as she settled into sleep was that Kevin Walsh was already planning his next moves in what he had decided was a game worth playing, and that the stakes would be higher than either of them initially realized. 3 weeks into her tenure at Blackstone Securities, Sarah had settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable and professional. She arrived each morning at 7:45, 15 minutes before the official start time, and used those quiet moments to review her priorities and prepare for the day ahead. Her work in risk assessment was proving both challenging and rewarding, exactly the kind of detail-oriented analysis that played to her strengths and experience. The Government Contracts Division was working on 3 major projects simultaneously, each requiring different levels of security clearance and specialized expertise. Sarah found herself naturally gravitating toward the most complex assignments, the ones that made her colleagues shake their heads in confusion while she saw clear patterns and manageable solutions. Her methodical approach and thorough documentation were already earning praise from David Harrison, who had begun routing the most sensitive projects through her desk. But with professional success came increased visibility, and increased visibility brought exactly the kind of attention Sarah had hoped to avoid. Kevin Walsh had appointed himself as her unofficial mentor, a role that gave him convenient excuses to drop by her cubicle throughout the day with questions that seemed designed more to gather information than to provide guidance. "Oh, you know, Sarah," Kevin said one Thursday afternoon, perching on the edge of her desk in a way that invaded her personal space, "I've been thinking about your background, and something doesn't quite add up for me. Your risk assessment skills are incredibly sophisticated, way beyond what you'd typically see from someone with a standard business background. Where exactly did you develop expertise in threat evaluation and security protocols?" Sarah looked up from her computer screen, her expression carefully neutral. "Previous consulting work involved a lot of cross-training in different areas," she replied, saving her document before giving Kevin her full attention. "When you're working with government contractors, you end up learning about security requirements whether you want to or not." "That makes sense," Kevin nodded, but his eyes were sharp with interest. "Though I have to say, the way you approached the Henderson Defense Contract Risk Assessment was pretty impressive. You identified vulnerabilities that our security consultants missed completely. That takes more than just on-the-job training, doesn't it?" Before Sarah could respond, Linda Morrison appeared with a stack of files and a knowing smile. "Kevin, are you bothering our resident genius again?" she asked with forced lightness. "David's looking for you in his office. Something about the quarterly projections you were supposed to have ready yesterday." Kevin's jaw tightened slightly at the reminder, but he maintained his casual demeanor. "Just trying to learn from the best," he said, sliding off Sarah's desk. "We should grab lunch sometime, Sarah. I'd love to hear more about your consulting work." After he left, Linda lingered for a moment. arranging the files on Sarah's desk with unnecessary precision. "You know, honey, Kevin's not usually this interested in new employees," she said quietly. "He's ambitious and smart, but he's also the type who sees everyone as either a stepping stone or a threat to his advancement. I'd be careful about how much you share with him." Sarah appreciated the warning, even though she had already reached the same conclusion herself. "I'll keep that in mind," she said diplomatically. "Right now I'm just focused on doing good work and learning the company culture." But Kevin's persistence was becoming harder to deflect with each passing day. He had begun making subtle comments about her clothing, suggesting that someone with her obvious intelligence might want to invest in a more professional wardrobe. He questioned her lunch choices, wondering aloud why someone would bring homemade sandwiches when the company cafeteria offered such good options. He even commented on her car, joking that the company parking garage looked like a luxury car dealership except for a few economy models that belonged to support staff. Each comment was delivered with a smile and wrapped in what could be interpreted as friendly concern, but the pattern was unmistakable. Kevin was systematically undermining her confidence while positioning himself as someone who could help her improve her image and advance her career. It was a sophisticated form of workplace bullying, the kind that was difficult to report because it never crossed any obvious lines. Sarah recognized the tactics because she had encountered them before in other contexts, though never in a corporate setting. She understood that Kevin was testing her responses, looking for signs of vulnerability or insecurity that he could exploit further. The problem was that fighting back too aggressively would only confirm his suspicion that there was something about her worth investigating. The breaking point came during a team meeting in late November, when David was reviewing project assignments for the upcoming quarter. Sarah had been asked to present her analysis of a new defense contract that involved security assessments for overseas installations, work that required understanding complex threat environments and risk mitigation strategies. Her presentation was thorough and professional, covering potential vulnerabilities and recommended safeguards with the kind of detailed expertise that impressed everyone in the room. She fielded questions confidently and provided additional insights that demonstrated deep understanding of the subject matter. By any measure, it was exactly the kind of performance that should have enhanced her reputation and credibility with her colleagues. But as the meeting wound down, Kevin raised his hand with what looked like an afterthought question. "This is really impressive work, Sarah," he began with apparent sincerity. "But I'm curious about something. Your analysis includes references to threat assessment methodologies that are pretty specialized, the kind of stuff they usually only teach in military or intelligence training programs. Did you pick that up during your consulting work, or do you have some background you haven't mentioned?" The conference room fell silent, and Sarah could feel everyone's attention focusing on her with new intensity. David Harrison looked genuinely curious, clearly wondering if there were additional qualifications that might affect future project assignments. Linda Morrison's expression was sympathetic, but watchful, as if she was trying to guess how Sarah would handle the pressure. "Risk assessment requires understanding how threats develop and evolve," Sarah replied calmly. "The methodologies are available through professional training programs and industry publications. It's just a matter of taking the time to study them properly." "Of course," Kevin agreed readily. "I only know that because my brother-in-law did some contracting work in Afghanistan and he used to talk about this stuff all the time. It's just interesting to see that level of familiarity in a civilian context." Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with being cornered by someone who was more perceptive than she had given him credit for. Kevin hadn't stumbled onto anything by accident. He had been researching and preparing for this moment. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he was doing it in front of an audience that would remember every word of this exchange. "I've always believed in being thorough," Sarah said finally, gathering her presentation materials with steady hands. "When you're assessing risks that could affect people's safety, it's important to understand all the angles." The meeting dispersed with the usual mixture of side conversations and transitioned back to individual workstations, but Sarah could feel the shift in how her colleagues were looking at her. Kevin's questions had planted seeds of curiosity and speculation that would grow in the coming days and weeks. She had become a puzzle to be solved rather than simply a competent colleague to be respected. Over the following days, the office dynamic continued to evolve in ways that made Sarah increasingly uncomfortable. During lunch breaks, she would catch fragments of conversations that stopped abruptly when she approached. Colleagues who had been warming up to her now seemed more formal in their interactions, as if they were waiting for additional information before deciding how to categorize her. Kevin, meanwhile, had shifted tactics from direct questioning to social manipulation. He began organizing informal gatherings after work, casual drinks or dinner invitations that were extended to most of the team but pointedly excluded Sarah. When she happened to overhear planning for these events, Kevin would offer elaborate explanations about why she probably wouldn't be interested, citing her apparent preference for privacy and her tendency to leave promptly at closing time. Sarah seems like more of a homebody, he would say with apparent consideration for her feelings. I wouldn't want to pressure her into social situations that might make her uncomfortable, especially when she's still getting settled here. The exclusions were presented as thoughtfulness, but they achieved exactly what Kevin intended. They isolated Sarah from the informal networks that were essential for success in any office environment. While her colleagues bonded over shared meals and casual conversations, she remained an outsider looking in, competent but not connected. The situation reached a new level of complexity when Margaret Chen from Human Resources scheduled Sarah's 3-month performance review earlier than usual. David Harrison had requested the meeting, citing concerns about team dynamics and the need to address some personnel issues that had come to his attention. Your work performance has been exemplary, David began, settling into his chair with the kind of serious expression that suggested difficult conversations ahead. Your technical skills are exactly what we needed, and your attention to detail has improved every project you've touched. But I'm getting some feedback about cultural fit that I think we need to discuss. Sarah had prepared for this conversation, knowing that Kevin's campaign of subtle undermining would eventually reach management level. I'm interested in your perspective, she said carefully. I've been focused on delivering quality work, but I'm always open to feedback about how I can contribute more effectively to the team. The issue isn't your work, David clarified, consulting notes that suggested he had been collecting observations for some time. It's more about integration with your colleagues. Several team members have mentioned that you seem reluctant to share personal information or participate in social activities. In a division that handles sensitive government contracts, trust and team cohesion are essential. It was a clever trap, Sarah realized. Her natural preference for privacy and her careful management of personal information were being reframed as antisocial behavior that could pose security risks. Kevin had managed to turn her greatest strengths as a covert operator into perceived weaknesses as a team member. I understand the importance of team cohesion, Sarah replied thoughtfully. I've been taking time to observe and learn before becoming more involved in social activities. In my experience, it's better to be thoughtful about relationships rather than rushing into them. David nodded, but she could see that he wasn't entirely convinced. I appreciate that approach, but I also need to be sure that all team members can work together effectively under pressure. Some of our projects involve tight deadlines and high-stress situations where personal trust becomes crucial. The meeting concluded with vague encouragements for Sarah to be more open with her colleagues and participate more actively in team-building activities. But Sarah understood the subtext. She was being put on notice that her job security depended on conforming to social expectations that conflicted with her need to maintain operational security about her background. Walking back to her cubicle after the meeting, Sarah felt the familiar weight of choices that had no good answers. She could continue trying to maintain her protective barriers and risk losing a job she actually enjoyed, or she could lower her defenses and risk exposing information that could endanger both her safety and her ability to transition successfully into civilian life. As she sat at her desk trying to focus on the risk assessment spreadsheet displayed on her computer screen, Sarah became aware that Kevin was watching her from across the office with the satisfied expression of someone whose careful planning was beginning to pay dividends. He had managed to weaponize her professionalism and turn her competence into a liability, all while maintaining plausible deniability about his motives. For the first time since starting at Blackstone Securities, Sarah began to consider whether this position was sustainable long-term. She had survived combat operations, intelligence missions, and hostile environments that most people couldn't imagine, but she was discovering that corporate politics could be just as treacherous in their own way. The enemy was harder to identify, the rules of engagement were unclear, and the consequences of miscalculation were different but potentially just as devastating. December brought the holiday season to Blackstone Securities, and with it an intensification of the social pressures that had been building around Sarah's presence in the office. The company's annual holiday party was scheduled for the second Friday of the month, and it had become the focal point for Kevin Walsh's latest campaign to isolate her from her colleagues while maintaining his image as a thoughtful team player. The party planning committee, led by Linda Morrison and enthusiastically supported by Kevin, had chosen an upscale hotel ballroom downtown for the event. The theme was winter elegance, which translated into expectations for formal attire and sophisticated social behavior that would stretch most employees' budgets and comfort zones. For Sarah, it represented exactly the kind of high-visibility social situation she had spent years learning to avoid. "You're coming to the party, right, Sarah?" Linda asked during a team meeting, her tone suggesting that attendance was not really optional. "We've got a great venue this year, and it's always such a good opportunity for everyone to relax and get to know each other outside of the work environment." Before Sarah could formulate a diplomatic response, Kevin jumped into the conversation with apparent enthusiasm. "Oh, Sarah should definitely come," he said with a smile that looked genuine to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. "Though I have to say the dress code might be a bit of a challenge. Winter elegance means cocktail attire at minimum, and I know some people find those expectations a little intimidating." The comment was perfectly crafted to sound supportive while actually highlighting Sarah's modest wardrobe and suggesting she might not fit in with the company's social expectations. Several colleagues glanced at Sarah's simple wool sweater and practical slacks, making mental notes about the contrast between her professional competence and her apparent lack of interest in making fashion statements. "I'll see if I can make it work with my schedule," Sarah replied neutrally, recognizing that any excuse she offered would be dissected and used against her later. "These events can be nice opportunities to see everyone in a different context." But Kevin wasn't finished yet. "You know what? I should introduce you to my girlfriend Amanda," he continued, pulling out his phone to show photos from a recent social media post. "She's got great taste in formal wear, and I bet she could give you some recommendations for places that won't break the bank. Sometimes it's just about knowing where to shop, right?" The offer was presented as helpful assistance, but it accomplished several goals simultaneously. It reminded everyone that Kevin had a girlfriend who understood fashion and social expectations. It reinforced the suggestion that Sarah needed help with her appearance, and it positioned him as someone generous enough to offer guidance to a colleague who was obviously out of her element. Sarah recognized the manipulation for what it was, but she also understood that refusing Kevin's help would be interpreted as antisocial behavior that confirmed his narrative about her difficulty fitting in with the team. She was being maneuvered into a position where any response would strengthen his case against her. "That's thoughtful of you," she said finally, "but I think I can manage to find something appropriate. I've navigated formal events before." "Of course you have," Kevin agreed quickly, but his expression suggested mild skepticism. "I just thought it might be helpful to get a local perspective, since you're still pretty new to the area and might not know all the best places to shop." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Sarah could see that Kevin had achieved exactly what he intended. Her colleagues now had a clear image of her as someone who might struggle with the social demands of company events, someone who needed guidance and assistance to navigate situations that came naturally to more socially integrated team members. Over the following days, the holiday party became a frequent topic of office conversation, with colleagues sharing details about their outfit plans and making arrangements to share transportation to the venue. Sarah found herself increasingly excluded from these discussions, not through any overt hostility, but through the subtle assumptions that she probably wasn't interested in participating or wouldn't have much to contribute to conversations about fashion and social planning. The exclusion was particularly noticeable during lunch breaks when informal groups would gather in the break room to discuss party details while Sarah ate her homemade sandwich alone at her desk. She could hear fragments of animated conversations about dress shopping, hair appointments, and after-party plans, all of which reinforced her status as an outsider who existed on the periphery of the social network that bound her colleagues together. Kevin had also begun a more systematic campaign of undermining her professional credibility, though he was careful to do it in ways that maintained plausible deniability. During project meetings, he would ask detailed questions about her methodologies that forced her to explain concepts that should have been straightforward, creating the impression that her work was more complicated than it needed to be. He would offer to help with tasks that she could easily handle herself, suggesting to observers that she might be struggling with workload management. Most damaging of all, he had begun making subtle references to security concerns related to team members who weren't fully integrated into the office culture. These comments were never directed specifically at Sarah, but they were timed and phrased in ways that made the connection obvious to anyone paying attention. "I was reading an interesting article about insider threats in government contracting," he mentioned during one team meeting, holding up his phone as if he had just discovered the information. "Apparently one of the biggest risk factors is employees who remain isolated from their colleagues, because it's harder to identify behavioral changes that might indicate security issues." David Harrison looked interested despite himself. "That makes sense from a security standpoint," he agreed. When people are integrated into the team culture, their colleagues are more likely to notice if something seems off about their behavior or attitudes. Exactly, Kevin continued enthusiastically. The article specifically mentioned that employees who resist social integration or seem reluctant to share personal information can create blind spots in security monitoring. Not because they're necessarily doing anything wrong, but because their colleagues don't know them well enough to recognize when something changes. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of being expertly maneuvered into an impossible position. Kevin was using legitimate security concerns to pathologize her natural preference for privacy, making it seem as though her professional competence was actually a potential liability for the organization. Any attempt to defend herself would only reinforce the impression that she was defensive and potentially hiding something significant. The conversation was interrupted by Margaret Chen from Human Resources, who appeared in the doorway with the kind of serious expression that suggested important business. "Sarah, could I speak with you privately for a few minutes?" she asked, her tone professionally neutral but carrying undertones that made everyone in the room take notice. As they walked toward Margaret's office, Sarah could feel her colleagues' eyes following them with the kind of intense curiosity that fed office gossip for days. She had no doubt that Kevin would find subtle ways to extract information about their conversation from anyone who might have insights into human resources discussions. Margaret's office felt smaller than usual as she closed the door and gestured for Sarah to take a seat. The desk between them was covered with files and documents that suggested preparation for a formal discussion, and Sarah noticed that her personnel folder was prominently displayed among the materials. "I want to be direct with you because I think you deserve honest feedback," Margaret began, settling into her chair with the kind of careful posture that suggested she had rehearsed this conversation. "I've been getting some concerns from your supervisor and colleagues about your integration into the team culture, and I think we need to address them before they become bigger issues." Sarah had been expecting this conversation since her earlier performance review with David Harrison, but the formal setting and Margaret's serious demeanor suggested that the situation had escalated beyond informal feedback into potential disciplinary territory. "I'm interested in understanding the specific concerns," Sarah replied carefully, "and how I can address them constructively." Margaret consulted her notes, which appeared to be extensive. The feedback centers around perceived lack of transparency about your background, reluctance to participate in team-building activities, and what some colleagues describe as resistance to forming professional relationships. I want to emphasize that no one is questioning your work quality or technical competence, but team cohesion is essential in this division. Each point was delivered with the kind of clinical precision that made them sound like objective observations rather than the subjective complaints they actually were. Sarah recognized that Kevin's campaign had been more systematic and effective than she had initially realized, building a documented case against her that would be difficult to refute without revealing information she couldn't afford to share. "I understand the importance of team relationships," Sarah said thoughtfully, "and I'm willing to work on being more actively engaged with my colleagues. I think there may have been some misunderstandings about my communication style, but those can definitely be addressed." Margaret nodded, but her expression remained serious. "I hope so, because the alternative is to consider whether this position is the right fit for your working style and preferences. The Government Contracts Division requires a high level of trust and collaboration, and that's only possible when team members feel comfortable with each other." It was delivered as guidance, but Sarah understood it was actually an ultimatum. Either she found ways to satisfy her colleagues' expectations for social integration, or she would be managed out of the organization despite her excellent work performance. Kevin had successfully transformed her greatest professional assets into perceived liabilities. The meeting concluded with vague commitments from Sarah to be more socially engaged and specific expectations that she would attend the holiday party as a demonstration of her commitment to team culture. As she walked back to her cubicle, Sarah reflected on how completely Kevin had outmaneuvered her using tools she had never learned to counter effectively. Her expertise in threat assessment, risk evaluation, and security protocols was useless against someone who understood how to weaponize social expectations and corporate culture. Kevin had identified her vulnerabilities with the precision of a trained operative and exploited them systematically while maintaining perfect cover as a helpful colleague concerned about team dynamics. That evening, as Sarah sat in her modest apartment reviewing the limited formal wear options in her closet, she found herself thinking about the choices that had led her to this moment. She had sacrificed recognition, advancement opportunities, and personal relationships to build a civilian life that allowed her to use her skills productively while maintaining the anonymity that kept her safe. But safety had its own costs, and she was discovering that the protective barriers she had constructed around her identity were being turned into weapons against her professional survival. Kevin Walsh had figured out how to exploit her greatest strength as a covert operator, her ability to blend in and remain unremarkable, and transform it into evidence of antisocial behavior that threatened team security. For the first time in years, Sarah began to consider whether the price of maintaining her cover identity might be higher than the risks of revealing at least some portion of her true background. The holiday party loomed ahead like a test she couldn't afford to fail, but passing it might require compromises that could unravel everything she had worked to build since transitioning out of military service. As she prepared for bed, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from her sister Maria, asking about holiday plans. The simple question highlighted how isolated she had become in her effort to maintain operational security, cutting herself off not just from colleagues but from family connections that might provide emotional support during difficult transitions. She typed and deleted several responses before settling on a brief message that conveyed basic information without revealing her current struggles. It was the same careful communication style that was causing problems at work, the same protective instincts that Kevin Walsh was systematically turning into evidence against her fitness for team membership. The irony wasn't lost on her that the skills that had kept her alive in genuinely dangerous situations were now threatening her ability to succeed in the relative safety of corporate America. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities for Kevin to demonstrate that Sarah Martinez was a problem that needed to be solved, preferably through voluntary resignation that would allow everyone to maintain plausible deniability about the true nature of the conflict. The night of the Blackstone Securities holiday party arrived with the kind of cold December rain that made elegant attire seem impractical and festive moods feel forced. Sarah stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting the simple black dress she had chosen for the evening, aware that her reflection showed exactly what Kevin Walsh and her colleagues expected to see. A woman who was trying too hard to fit into a social situation where she clearly didn't belong. She had spent the previous weekend shopping for something appropriate, settling on a conservative dress that met the formal requirements without drawing attention to itself or to her. The saleswoman at the department store had been helpful but clearly puzzled by Sarah's insistence on practical considerations like ease of movement and modest necklines over fashion trends and style statements. The hotel ballroom was already crowded when Sarah arrived, having deliberately timed her entrance to avoid the awkward early moments when small groups of close colleagues would be forming and reforming around shared drinks and familiar conversations. She could see immediately that her strategy hadn't worked. If anything, arriving when the party was already in full swing only emphasized her outsider status more clearly. Kevin Walsh was holding court near the bar, dressed in an expensive suit that fit him perfectly and surrounded by colleagues who seemed genuinely entertained by whatever story he was telling. His girlfriend Amanda was exactly what Sarah had expected from the photos she had seen. Polished, confident, and completely at ease in the kind of social situation that made Sarah feel like she was performing a character she had never quite mastered. "Sarah!" Linda Morrison appeared at her elbow with the kind of enthusiastic greeting that was designed to be overheard by nearby colleagues. "I'm so glad you made it." "You look lovely. That dress is perfect for you." Very classic and professional. The compliment was delivered with apparent warmth, but Sarah caught the subtle emphasis on words like classic and professional that reinforced the impression that her style choices were safe and unremarkable, rather than fashionable or sophisticated. It was the kind of carefully constructed praise that seemed supportive while actually highlighting perceived shortcomings. "Thank you," Sarah replied with a smile that she hoped looked genuine. "You look wonderful too." The party planning committee did an amazing job with the venue. Linda beamed at the acknowledgement of her contribution to the event organization, and Sarah could see that she had scored a minor social victory by recognizing her colleagues' efforts. But the success felt hollow, a calculated move in a game she had never wanted to play, rather than a genuine expression of appreciation. As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself navigating a series of conversations that felt like performance evaluations disguised as casual social interaction. Colleagues who barely acknowledged her during normal work hours suddenly seemed intensely interested in her personal life, her background, and her thoughts about various topics that had nothing to do with risk assessment or government contracts. "So Sarah," said Marcus Williams, one of the senior analysts who rarely spoke to her in the office, "I've been curious about your background. Kevin mentioned that you have some really interesting experience in security consulting. What kind of projects were you working on before you came here?" The question was delivered with apparent genuine interest, but Sarah could see Kevin watching their interaction from across the room. with the kind of focused attention that suggested he had orchestrated this particular conversation. She realized that her colleagues had been briefed to gather information about her background, using the relaxed atmosphere of the party as cover for interrogation techniques that would seem too aggressive in a professional setting. "I worked on risk assessment for various government contractors," Sarah replied, falling back on the same carefully vague description she had used during her job interview. "Nothing as interesting as the projects we handle here, but good preparation for understanding how security requirements affect business operations." Marcus nodded as if her answer was perfectly satisfactory, but she could see that he was mentally cataloguing her response for future analysis. "That must have involved a lot of travel," he continued conversationally. "Did you work mostly domestic projects, or did you get sent overseas much?" It was a more specific question than Sarah had expected, the kind that suggested either genuine curiosity or careful preparation. She found herself wondering how much research Kevin had done about security consulting work, and what kinds of follow-up questions he had prepared for his colleagues to ask. "Some of both," she said diplomatically, though most of the overseas work was pretty routine. Site visits, document reviews, that sort of thing. Nothing very exciting compared to what you see in movies. She had learned that the best way to deflect curiosity about her background was to make it sound boring rather than mysterious. But she could see that Marcus wasn't entirely convinced by her casual dismissal of what sounded like potentially significant experience. Before he could ask another question, David Harrison appeared with a drink in his hand and the kind of relaxed demeanor that only appeared at company social events. "Sarah, I'm glad to see you decided to join us tonight. How are you finding the party?" "It's lovely," Sarah replied honestly, grateful for the interruption even though she suspected David's appearance wasn't entirely coincidental. "The venue is beautiful, and it's nice to see everyone outside of the office environment." David nodded approvingly, and Sarah could see that her attendance at the party was being noted as evidence of improved team integration. "I wanted to mention that your work on the Henderson contract has been excellent," he continued, his voice carrying far enough to be overheard by nearby colleagues. "The client specifically complimented the thoroughness of your risk assessment. It was the kind of professional recognition that should have felt rewarding, but Sarah found herself analyzing David's motives for delivering the praise publicly rather than simply appreciating the acknowledgement of her work quality. She was becoming hyper-aware of the performance aspects of every interaction, the way that seemingly casual conversations were actually opportunities for observation and evaluation. The breaking point came later in the evening, when the party had reached the stage where alcohol had loosened tongues and lowered social inhibitions. Sarah was standing near the windows that overlooked the city, taking a brief break from the constant pressure of managing conversations and maintaining her carefully constructed persona. Kevin Walsh approached with Amanda at his side, both of them carrying drinks that clearly weren't their first of the evening. His girlfriend was beautiful in an obvious way, with the kind of polished appearance that came from professional styling and expensive maintenance. She looked like exactly the type of woman who would date someone like Kevin, confident and social and completely comfortable being the center of attention. "Sarah, I don't think you've properly met Amanda," Kevin said with exaggerated courtesy, his words slightly slurred but his eyes sharp with focus. "Amanda, this is Sarah Martinez, our mysterious new risk assessment specialist." Amanda extended a manicured hand with a smile that seemed genuinely friendly. "Kevin's told me so much about you," she said warmly. "He says you're incredibly talented, but also pretty private about your background." "I love a woman with secrets." The comment was delivered as a compliment, but Sarah could see Kevin's satisfaction with how his girlfriend had inadvertently reinforced his narrative about Sarah's mysterious nature. It was the kind of casual observation that would stick in people's minds and color their future interactions with her. "I wouldn't say I'm mysterious," Sarah replied with a laugh that she hoped sounded natural. "Just focused on doing good work and learning how things operate here. Kevin's been very helpful in showing me the ropes." "Oh, he's always trying to help people," Amanda agreed enthusiastically, her arms sliding around Kevin's waist in a gesture of casual possessiveness. "He's got such a good eye for talent and potential. He was just telling me earlier that he thinks you could really go far in this company if you learn to open up more and show people who you really are." Kevin's expression flickered with something that might have been annoyance at his girlfriend's directness, but he recovered quickly with a smile that looked genuinely supportive. "I just think Sarah's got a lot more to offer than she's comfortable sharing yet," he said smoothly. "Sometimes it takes a while for people to feel safe enough to let their guard down completely." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the bar, where two colleagues were engaged in the kind of increasingly loud disagreement that threatened to escalate into something embarrassing for everyone involved. As attention shifted toward the developing situation, Sarah saw an opportunity to excuse herself and retreat to the relative safety of the ladies' room. But as she walked away from Kevin and Amanda, she overheard a fragment of conversation that stopped her in her tracks. Amanda was speaking in a voice that was pitched to carry just far enough to reach Sarah's ears. "I don't know what it is about her, but something feels off. Like she's playing a role rather than just being herself, you know?" Sarah felt the familiar cold sensation in her stomach that came with operational exposure, the recognition that her carefully maintained cover identity was beginning to unravel despite all her precautions. Amanda's observation was more perceptive than she had expected, and it suggested that her performance as a normal civilian employee wasn't as convincing as she had hoped. In the ladies' room, Sarah stared at her reflection in the ornate mirror and tried to assess how much damage had been done to her position at Blackstone Securities. Kevin's campaign against her had been successful beyond what she had initially thought possible, turning her natural professionalism and privacy into evidence of antisocial behavior and potential security risks. But more concerning than Kevin's professional manipulation was the growing sense that her fundamental approach to civilian integration might be flawed. She had spent years learning to blend in by being unremarkable, but she was discovering that unremarkable could be its own form of suspicious behavior in an environment where people expected personal connections and social engagement. When she returned to the party, Sarah found that the evening's dynamic had shifted in subtle but significant ways. Colleagues who had been making efforts to include her in conversations now seemed more cautious in their interactions, as if Amanda's casual observation about her seeming artificial had spread through the crowd with the efficiency of office gossip. Kevin was still working the room with practiced ease, but Sarah noticed that he was keeping track of her movements with the kind of systematic attention that suggested he was building towards something more significant than the social manipulation she had experienced so far. His girlfriend's insights had apparently given him new ammunition for whatever campaign he was planning next. The party began winding down around 11 o'clock, with colleagues making arrangements for shared rides home and exchanging contact information for future social events. Sarah found herself increasingly isolated as these informal groups formed around her, not through any overt hostility, but through the simple fact that she had no established relationships to build upon. As she waited for the valet to retrieve her car, Sarah reflected on the evening's events with the analytical precision that had served her well in other contexts. Kevin Walsh had succeeded in positioning her as an outsider who was trying too hard to fit in while simultaneously failing to meet the social expectations that define success in their workplace culture. The most troubling aspect of the situation was that Kevin seemed to understand intuitively that there was something significant about her background, even though he clearly didn't know what that something might be. His questions and comments suggested that he had identified patterns in her behavior that indicated professional training or experience beyond what she had disclosed. Driving home through the quiet streets, Sarah found herself thinking about the choices that lay ahead. She could continue trying to maintain her cover identity and hope that Kevin's interest would eventually fade, or she could consider more dramatic alternatives that might protect her long-term security at the cost of short-term disruption. What she couldn't know as she parked outside her apartment building was that Kevin Walsh was already planning his next move, and that he had decided Sarah Martinez represented both an interesting puzzle to solve and a potential threat to his own advancement within the company. The holiday party had given him new insights into her vulnerabilities, and he intended to use them systematically until he either uncovered her secrets or forced her to leave Blackstone Securities voluntarily. The game was about to enter a new phase, one that would test not only Sarah's ability to maintain her civilian cover, but also her willingness to protect it at any cost. January brought a bitter cold snap to the city, and with it an escalation in Kevin Walsh's campaign that pushed Sarah Martinez closer to a decision point she had hoped never to face. The holiday party had provided Kevin with new ammunition and fresh insights into her vulnerabilities, and he was using both with the methodical precision of someone who had made her professional destruction his personal project. The attacks had become more sophisticated and systematic, moving beyond casual undermining into territory that bordered on workplace harassment. Kevin had begun questioning her work methods in formal project meetings, forcing her to explain routine procedures in ways that made them seem unnecessarily complicated or potentially unreliable. He volunteered to double-check her analyses, suggesting to management that quality control was essential when dealing with someone whose background remained somewhat unclear. Most damaging of all, he had started making veiled references to security concerns that could arise from employing people who weren't fully transparent about their professional history. These comments were never directed specifically at Sarah, but they were delivered with timing and context that made the intended target obvious to everyone present. I was reading about a case where a government contractor got in serious trouble because they didn't properly vet an employee's background, Kevin mentioned during a team meeting in late January, scrolling through his phone as if he had just discovered the information. Apparently, the person had previous experience that they hadn't disclosed fully, and when it came out later, it raised questions about whether they had been honest during the hiring process. David Harrison looked up from the quarterly reports he was reviewing, his expression showing the kind of interest that suggested Kevin had touched on something he had been thinking about privately. "What kind of undisclosed experience?" he asked, setting down his pen to give Kevin his full attention. "Military or intelligence background that went beyond what they put on their resume," Kevin replied, maintaining the casual tone that made his comments seem like innocent information sharing rather than calculated character assassination. The problem wasn't necessarily that they had that experience, but that they weren't upfront about it when they applied for security clearances. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of being trapped in a situation where any response would confirm Kevin's implied accusations. If she remained silent, her colleagues would interpret it as suspicious behavior that validated their growing concerns about her transparency. If she defended herself too vigorously, it would only reinforce the impression that she was hiding something significant. "Background verification is definitely important," she said carefully. "Though I imagine most of these cases involve misunderstandings about what information is considered relevant for disclosure." Kevin nodded with apparent agreement, but his eyes were sharp with the satisfaction of someone whose trap was working exactly as planned. "That's probably true," he conceded readily. "Though from a security standpoint, it's always better to err on the side of too much information rather than too little, don't you think?" Before Sarah could formulate a response that wouldn't make her situation worse, Margaret Chen appeared in the doorway with the kind of serious expression that brought all conversation to an immediate halt. "Sarah, could I speak with you privately?" she asked with professional courtesy that couldn't quite disguise the gravity of whatever had prompted the interruption. As they walked toward Margaret's office, Sarah could feel her colleague's eyes following them with the kind of intense curiosity that would fuel speculation for the rest of the day. Kevin's timing had been perfect. As usual, setting up a situation where her being called to human resources would seem like a natural consequence of the concerns he had been raising about security and transparency. Margaret's office felt different this time, more formal and less welcoming than during their previous conversations. The desk was arranged with documents that suggested preparation for a significant discussion, and Sarah noticed that her personnel file was accompanied by materials she hadn't seen before, including what appeared to be official correspondence from external agencies. "I need to be direct with you because the situation has become more complicated than either of us anticipated," Margaret began, settling into her chair with the kind of careful posture that suggested she had prepared extensively for this conversation. "We've received some inquiries about your background that require clarification before we can continue processing your security clearance application." Sarah felt her carefully constructed civilian identity beginning to crumble around the edges, but she maintained her composed expression while her mind raced through possible responses and their potential consequences. "What kind of inquiries?" she asked calmly, buying time to assess how much information had been uncovered and what her options might be. Margaret consulted the documents on her desk, clearly reading from prepared notes rather than speaking extemporaneously. "The preliminary background investigation has identified some discrepancies between the information you provided on your application and what appears in various government databases. Specifically, there are gaps in your employment history that correspond to periods of military service that weren't disclosed on your resume or security clearance forms." It was the moment Sarah had been dreading since she first decided to pursue civilian employment in the government contracting sector. Her carefully constructed cover identity was being systematically dismantled by the same security protocols she had once helped to design and implement in other contexts. "I can explain those discrepancies," Sarah said quietly, recognizing that she had reached the decision point where maintaining her cover story might do more harm than revealing at least some portion of the truth. "My military service involved classified assignments that I was advised to omit from civilian employment applications to avoid complications during the clearance process." Margaret nodded as if she had expected this explanation, which suggested that the Human Resources Department had been dealing with similar situations before. "I understand the complexity of transitioning from classified military roles to civilian employment," she said with apparent sympathy, "but the investigators need official documentation to verify your service history and determine whether there are any security implications we need to address." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Sarah had experienced during her years of carefully managed civilian integration. Margaret was professional and understanding, but she was also methodical in her approach to extracting information that Sarah had spent years learning to protect through misdirection and carefully constructed half-truths. By the time they finished their discussion, Sarah had been forced to acknowledge that her military service had involved specialized training and deployment to overseas locations, though she had managed to avoid providing specific details about the nature of her assignments or the level of security clearances she had previously held. I want to be clear that none of this information changes our assessment of your work performance or your value to the organization, Margaret emphasized as their meeting concluded. But the security clearance process requires complete transparency and will need to coordinate with the investigating agencies to ensure that your background is properly documented and verified. Walking back to her cubicle, Sarah felt the weight of exposure in ways that were both familiar and entirely new. In operational contexts, blown cover meant immediate extraction and reassignment to different missions with different identities. In the civilian world, it meant facing colleagues who would now view her through the lens of whatever partial truths emerged from the security investigation process. Kevin Walsh was waiting at her desk with the kind of concerned expression that would look genuinely supportive to anyone who didn't understand his true motives. "Everything okay?" he asked with apparent sympathy. "You looked pretty serious when Margaret called you away from the meeting." "Just routine paperwork related to security clearances," Sarah replied, settling into her chair and turning toward her computer screen in a clear signal that she wasn't interested in prolonging the conversation. "Nothing that affects current projects." But Kevin wasn't ready to let the opportunity pass without extracting maximum value from her obvious discomfort. "Security clearances can be pretty stressful," he agreed conversationally. "All those background interviews and document reviews. I went through it when I first started here, and it's amazing how thorough they are about verifying every detail of your work history." The comment was perfectly crafted to sound supportive while actually increasing the pressure Sarah felt about whatever revelations might emerge from the investigation process. Kevin had positioned himself as someone who understood the clearance process well enough to recognize when someone might be concerned about specific aspects of their background being scrutinized. Over the following weeks, the office dynamic shifted in ways that reflected the growing speculation about Sarah's background and the mysterious circumstances surrounding her security clearance review. Colleagues who had previously been neutral or mildly supportive began maintaining more professional distance, as if they were waiting for additional information before deciding how to categorize her within their mental organizational framework. The breakthrough came on a Friday afternoon in early February, when David Harrison called an impromptu team meeting to discuss staffing changes for an urgent project that had just been awarded to the company. The contract involved security assessments for a series of overseas installations, work that required both technical expertise and personnel who could obtain the highest levels of security clearance within compressed timeframes. "We've been selected to conduct comprehensive threat assessments for 3 facilities in different geographic regions," David explained, consulting notes that suggested the project details were still being finalized. "The client needs someone who can hit the ground running with minimal briefing time, someone with extensive experience in overseas security environments and threat evaluation methodologies." Sarah recognized immediately that the project description matched her background and expertise more closely than anything else the company had handled during her tenure. The risk assessment methodologies, geographic considerations, and security protocols involved were all areas where her previous experience would provide significant advantages over colleagues who had only civilian contractor backgrounds. "The timeline is aggressive," David continued, "and the security clearance requirements are substantial. We're talking about top secret with additional compartmented access, which typically takes months to process unless someone already holds comparable clearances from previous employment." Kevin Walsh leaned forward in his chair with obvious interest. "That sounds like exactly the kind of project where Sarah's mysterious consulting background might finally come in handy," he said with a smile that looked genuinely supportive but carried undertones that everyone present could detect. It was the moment when Kevin's campaign of systematic undermining intersected with circumstances that would force the truth about Sarah's background into the open, regardless of her preferences for maintaining privacy and anonymity. The project requirements made her previous experience directly relevant to business operations, which meant that continued evasion about her background would be impossible. David Harrison was looking at Sarah with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was beginning to piece together information that had been accumulating over the previous months. "Sarah, your risk assessment work has been consistently impressive, and some of your methodologies suggest familiarity with protocols that aren't typically taught in civilian training programs. Would you be interested in taking point on this project?" The question hung in the air like a challenge that required immediate response. Sarah could see that every colleague in the room was waiting for her answer with the kind of intense curiosity that would remember every word and analyze every inflection for hidden meaning. For months, she had been navigating the delicate balance between professional competence and personal anonymity, trying to contribute effectively to her team while protecting the aspects of her background that she preferred to keep private. But the project David was describing represented exactly the kind of work she had been trained to handle, and her expertise could make the difference between success and failure for both the company and the client. "I'd be very interested," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. "And yes, I do have relevant experience that might be helpful for this type of assignment." David nodded as if her response confirmed suspicions he had been developing for some time. "What kind of relevant experience are we talking about?" Sarah looked around the conference room at colleagues who had spent months speculating about her background, wondering about her qualifications, and in Kevin's case, actively working to undermine her credibility and professional standing. She thought about the choices that had led her to this moment and the price she had paid to maintain anonymity in a world that valued transparency and social integration above privacy and professionalism. Then she reached into her briefcase and withdrew a small leather folder that she had carried with her every day, but never expected to open in a civilian workplace. Her fingers traced the embossed seal on the cover before she opened it to reveal the credentials and insignia that told a story she had kept hidden since the day she decided to transition into civilian employment. "My name is Sarah Martinez," she said calmly, her voice carrying a new authority that her colleagues had never heard before. "And I hold the rank of Lieutenant General in the United States Navy SEALs, with specialized experience in counterterrorism operations, threat assessment, and overseas security coordination." The conference room fell absolutely silent as she placed her military identification and service medals on the table where everyone could see them clearly. The Navy SEAL Trident gleamed under the fluorescent lights, its distinctive design immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with elite military units. Kevin Walsh's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical under different circumstances, shifting from smug satisfaction to confusion to dawning horror as he realized the magnitude of his miscalculation. For months, he had been systematically attacking and undermining someone whose actual qualifications and background made his own accomplishments look insignificant by comparison. David Harrison stared at the credentials with the kind of stunned recognition that comes from suddenly understanding that everything you thought you knew about a situation was completely wrong. "Lieutenant General Martinez," he said slowly, as if testing how the title sounded when applied to the quiet woman who had been bringing homemade sandwiches to work and driving an economy car to their meetings. Sarah nodded calmly, her entire demeanor transformed by the revelation of her true identity and the authority that came with it. "I apologize for the necessity of maintaining operational security about my background," she said, with the kind of measured professionalism that made it clear she was accustomed to briefing senior officials and managing complex situations. "I transitioned to civilian employment as part of a planned career change, but my previous experience is directly applicable to the kind of threat assessment and security coordination work that this project requires. I can have the facility assessments completed within your timeline, and I already hold the security clearances necessary for immediate deployment to any of the geographic regions under consideration." The silence stretched for several more seconds, as everyone in the room processed the implications of what they had just learned. Linda Morrison was staring at Sarah with the kind of expression people get when they realize they've been completely wrong about someone they thought they understood. Marcus Williams looked like he was mentally reviewing every casual conversation he'd had with her and wondering what other assumptions he needed to reconsider. But it was Kevin Walsh's reaction that captured everyone's attention, because his usual confidence had evaporated completely, replaced by the dawning realization that he had spent months publicly challenging and undermining one of the most highly trained and decorated military officers in the room. Sarah turned toward Kevin with the kind of direct eye contact that made it clear she had been aware of his campaign against her from the beginning and had chosen to endure it rather than reveal information that might compromise her transition to civilian life. "Kevin, I want you to know that I understood what you were trying to accomplish with your questions about my background and your efforts to position me as a security risk to the organization," she said with quiet authority that made every word carry significant weight. "Your concerns about team integration and transparency were noted and taken seriously, even though they were based on incomplete information about my qualifications and experience." Kevin's mouth opened and closed several times without producing any sound, his usual eloquence completely abandoned in the face of a revelation that transformed every interaction they had ever had, into evidence of his own poor judgment and unprofessional behavior. David Harrison recovered his voice first, his tone carrying the kind of respect that senior executives reserve for individuals whose credentials and experience command immediate recognition. General Martinez, I think it's safe to say that we would very much like you to take point on this project, and I suspect our client will be extremely pleased to learn about the level of expertise we can bring to their security requirements. Sarah smiled for the first time since revealing her background, a genuine expression of satisfaction that came from finally being able to use her training and experience without reservation or apology. I'll be happy to handle the threat assessments, she said simply. It's exactly the kind of work I've been hoping to contribute to since joining Blackstone Securities. As the meeting dispersed and her colleagues filed out of the conference room with shell-shocked expressions and the kind of excited energy that comes from witnessing dramatic revelations, Sarah remained seated at the conference table, carefully returning her credentials to the leather folder that had protected them throughout her months of anonymity. Kevin Walsh lingered near the doorway, clearly wanting to say something but apparently unable to formulate words that might begin to address the magnitude of his miscalculation. Sarah looked up at him with an expression that was neither hostile nor particularly forgiving, just professionally neutral in the way that senior officers learn to manage subordinates who have made significant errors in judgment. "Kevin," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough authority to make it clear that this was not a conversation between equals. "I hope this experience has been educational for you about the importance of not making assumptions about people based on incomplete information." He nodded mutely and left the conference room without attempting to offer explanations or apologies that would only make his situation worse. Sarah watched him go with the kind of calm satisfaction that comes from finally being able to drop a cover identity that had become more burdensome than protective. The rest of that afternoon passed in a blur of congratulations from colleagues who suddenly understood why her work had been so consistently excellent, apologies from people who realized they had been excluding someone whose experience and qualifications far exceeded their own, and planning meetings with David Harrison about the overseas security project that would allow her to use her expertise fully for the first time since joining the civilian workforce. As she packed her briefcase at the end of the day, Sarah reflected on the choices that had led her to this moment, and the price she had paid for maintaining anonymity in a world that ultimately rewarded authenticity and expertise over protective camouflage. The revelation of her true background had been inevitable once the security clearance investigation began, but the timing had worked out better than she could have hoped. Walking to a car through the same parking garage where Kevin Walsh had once made dismissive comments about economy models, Sarah felt the weight of months of careful performance lifting from her shoulders. She was still the same person who preferred practical clothing and homemade lunches over expensive displays of status, but she no longer had to apologize for those choices or worry that they would be interpreted as evidence of inadequate social integration. The weekend ahead promised to be different from the solitary evenings and careful social management that had characterized her first months at Blackstone Securities. Her phone was already showing messages from colleagues who wanted to learn more about her background, and from David Harrison about the strategic planning sessions they would need to conduct before beginning the overseas project. Most importantly, she no longer had to waste energy maintaining a cover identity that had become counterproductive to her professional goals and personal satisfaction. Lieutenant General Sarah Martinez was finally free to be herself in the civilian world, with all the authority, expertise, and confidence that came with her true identity and accomplishments. The transformation was complete, and the woman who drove out of the parking garage that evening was no longer the quietly competent employee who had been enduring months of systematic undermining. She was a decorated military officer whose expertise was finally being recognized and utilized appropriately, and who had learned valuable lessons about the costs and benefits of authenticity in civilian professional environments. Kevin Walsh would spend the weekend contemplating the wreckage of his carefully constructed campaign and wondering how he could possibly recover from having publicly challenged someone whose qualifications made his own accomplishments seem insignificant by comparison. But that was his problem to solve, and Sarah Martinez had more important things to focus on than managing the consequences of other people's poor judgment and unprofessional behavior.